Hi there. I wanted to talk a little bit about the interview and the questions to ask during the interview. And we've gone over open-ended questions, and what we've learned up to this point on open-ended questions is an open-ended question can't simply be answered. It can't be answered with yes or no. A couple of tips there is if you start a question with do or does, that will automatically close your question. Do you like chocolate? Rather than what kind of ice cream do you like? That's just a simple difference between an open-ended and a closed-ended question. The reason that you ask open-ended questions in most interviews and in most communications would be to get to know the person, get to know more about them, have them talk from rather than just simply answering a particular question you're seeking an answer to give you as much information as there is. When we're getting to know someone, in some sort of process, whether it's a social situation or if it's work-related or even in a classroom, when we ask questions that are open, we get to find out who that person is rather than just how much they align with the particular idea we have or how they, if they answer a question, how we want them to. When you get into asking a lot of closed questions, yes or no questions, or one-word, two-word answer questions, it almost becomes like interrogating someone. Do you like chocolate? No. Do you like vanilla? No. Do you like strawberry? No. And you can avoid that bit of frustration or a bit of just back and forth in a communication if you simply would have asked to begin with, what kind of ice cream do you like? Which kind of ice cream do you prefer? What are your favorite ice creams? And I hope that makes some sense to you. Now, I also want to address the reason not to use the term why in a question. The term why, a lot of it has to do with voice inflection, but it can cause a person to feel a bit defensive. And you've learned up to this point in the course that we don't always know what another person's history is. We don't know how they think, what they value, their life circumstances, things they've experienced up to now. So the question why to one person may not be something that would cause someone to be defensive at all, while to the person sitting right next to them, it could cause defensiveness. So just eliminating it is the easiest way to go about doing that. And almost any question you have that you'd like to begin with why, you can turn it around and do it in a way that doesn't ask the word why, but still brings you to the same answer you probably wanted to explore to begin with. And then finally, two-part questions. I think we're trained to do this, especially with education. We're given a test or an essay question to write, and someone will say, talk about, the pros and cons of the Civil War, and do you disagree? Do you agree or disagree? Why or why not? That's those kinds of questions in the world of education are pretty normal. That's how a lot of them are stated, but they don't sound as they don't flow as well whenever you're communicating with someone. Number one, if you ask a two-part question, oftentimes you won't get both parts answered. Secondly, any two-part question sometimes has an intention to it. You're asking a question and then asking the real question. Do you agree with the Civil War? Why or why not? You really want to know about the why or why not part, not just the yes piece of the question. So just to turn that into one question, asking ultimately the same thing, you can do it, just streamline it down to one question. Tell me your thoughts about the Civil War. And that way you get to find out pretty quickly. A person would tell you whether they agreed or disagreed with the Civil War and all the reasons. If they in fact have an opinion about it, they would tell you. And then the final thing I want to talk about is the flow of the questions you ask. A couple of you have asked me, am I on the right track with these questions? And you're on the right track if the question makes sense to you and if you can formulate it in an open way and the person can understand the question. I'll give you feedback. Your classmates will give you feedback if the question doesn't quite make sense, and you might want to reformulate it or rework it a little bit. The flow that you ask the questions in, I think most of the time when we interview people, some of this has a little bit to do with how well we know the person, but by and large, when we start an interview, we start with the smaller questions. We get to the larger, deeper, perhaps things as we go into the interview. And I may have, if I go into an interview with someone, I may have 15 questions ready and only ask 10 of them, because I recognize by about question 3 that the person isn't going to give me a lot of information, or they're not going to go as deeply as maybe I was hoping they would. So I might just abandon those couple of questions that might be too difficult for that situation. And then again, I may go into an interview, and after 3 questions, I see that the person's ready for question number 8 already, and asking the other ones wouldn't be beneficial. So I may want to just go ahead and go in that direction. Now, of course, you'll still ask 10 questions, but you can have some extra ones prepared in case the interview doesn't go exactly how you were planning, or if it goes much quicker than you were planning as far as getting to the meat of the information that you want. I like to put questions in a way that flow and make sense. For instance, I don't want to ask a person what their major is, then ask them where they went to elementary school, because those things don't necessarily flow. You might want to talk about the history of their education in the beginning, and then work up to the future of their education, or vice versa. But you don't want to interchange the questions. You don't want to make it, I guess the term I use is choppy. You don't want to ask a question about one thing, move to another subject, and then come back to another thing. And do that time and time again in the interview. You want to keep it kind of moving in a direction, just like a conversation, just like you do with your friends. You ask them a question and you start engaging in a conversation. And if the conversation's flowing and engaged, it won't jump back over to something and jump back over to another one if you're engaged with that person at that moment. So I hope those tips help. I hope that my explaining the reasons behind the way you formulate your questions for this interview helps. Addressing the why question just one more time. Some people do use the why question. Many times in business you use the why question. But in counseling, especially in counseling with people who have disabilities or some other type of a diagnosis in the mental health arena, you just may want to avoid that, because you don't necessarily know what the background is, and you don't want to create defensiveness in an interview when it could so easily be avoided by just rewording your question. I hope that helps, and as always, I look forward to continuing to read your work.